When you think of Europe today, do you still picture a human rights utopia? A high welfare paradise where everyone enjoys a 4-day workweek and pristine environments? Read the macroeconomic reports of the last decade. You will find a history of capital stagnation, where the physical economy is quietly rusting away. Mainstream media offers a convenient explanation for this decline, attributing it directly to the sudden supply chain shocks caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. Geopolitical strategists define Europe's current collapse as a meticulously designed strategic harvest. The bureaucrats in Brussels have allowed ideological alignment and political correctness to override the absolute baseline of national survival. The very continent that birthed the Industrial Revolution is now being actively carved up, becoming the richest spoil of war for Wall Street and American energy giants. Europe's decay represents the mathematical outcome of a political class sacrificing its physical economy to appease an imperial ally. For the past 30 years, the abstract concept of the Germanic spirit of craftsmanship masked the physical requirements of the European economic miracle. High welfare and heavy industry depend on specific geostrategic inputs. This diagram shows the true structure underlying European manufacturing, a triangle built on cheap energy, a consumer market, and a security umbrella. The first pillar was cheap natural gas flowing from the east. Without cheap heat and power, smelting steel loses its economic logic. The entity providing this critical lifeblood was Russia, operating through massive state-owned facilities like Gazprom. The second pillar was the ultimate buyer capable of digesting Europe's massive high-end manufacturing output. China's enormous consumer market and supply chain capacity provided the necessary demand to keep European factories running. The final pillar was the United States, providing a free security umbrella. By outsourcing their defense to America, European nations redirected billions in military spending directly into their famous social welfare systems. As global tensions escalated and war broke out in Ukraine, European politicians chose to prioritize ideology, actively severing their access to cheap Russian natural gas. Simultaneously, under pressure from Washington, Europe began de-risking its relationship with China. De-risking is a diplomatic term for reducing trade and investment ties to minimize perceived economic reliance on a strategic competitor. Stripped of their cheapest energy source and alienated from their largest buyer, the foundational logic for physical manufacturing in Europe has vanished. In late September 2022, the underwater energy artery connecting Russia and Germany was blown up. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline physically castrated Germany's industrial heart, permanently dismantling the infrastructure that made their factories profitable. Western mainstream media has remained remarkably quiet about the culprit, but the cold laws of geopolitics dictate that we ask one simple question: who benefits most from this destruction? The explosion achieved an irreversible political outcome, removing any path for Europe to negotiate a future reconciliation with Russia and restore its cheap gas supply. This chart shows the immediate financial penalty. Forced to find alternatives, Europe began purchasing liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Europe is now paying 3 to 4 times more for American LNG than they did for Russian piped gas. The true winner here was Europe's closest ally. The United States used a proxy war to severely drain Russian military and economic resources. In the process, they downgraded Europe from an allied peer to an economic vassal, entirely dependent on American energy just to survive. Long before the energy crisis, EU bureaucrats designed the strictest environmental regulations on the planet. They established rigorous ESG standards, environmental, social, and governance criteria, used to force companies to reduce carbon emissions. But physics does not care about morals. Without the support of cheap Russian gas, these green regulations became a noose around the neck of European enterprises. Industrial giants found themselves trapped between astronomical energy costs and crushing green taxes. The chemical titan BASF is now actively shrinking its domestic footprint and shifting billions in production capacity overseas. Volkswagen, the cornerstone of European automotive engineering, is following suit, rapidly reallocating its capital away from its home country. These tens of billions of euros are relocating to China, which still possesses a fully integrated supply chain, and to the United States. Washington specifically targeted this vulnerable European capital with the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. The IRA is a sweeping piece of U.S. legislation that offers massive tax subsidies to manufacturing companies that build their factories on American soil. Europe is currently enduring a brutal hollowing out of its physical industries, occurring legally and under the banner of political correctness. Universal healthcare, generous unemployment benefits, and short working hours were entirely paid for by the massive profit margins of Europe's historical industrial might. With the factories fleeing and capital draining away, the system has lost its ability to generate wealth, surviving instead on a toxic diet of endless sovereign debt. The middle and working classes are caught in a vice of high inflation, doubled energy bills, and the social fracturing caused by unrestricted refugee influxes. This economic suffocation has spilled onto the streets. When citizens realize their wages are evaporating in foreign aid while their own living standards plummet, the social fabric tears. The surge of far-right political parties across Germany, France, and Italy reflects an electorate screaming out in economic desperation. The shifting regimes and social unrest tearing through Europe stem from the complete loss of geopolitical autonomy. The bureaucratic class in Brussels elevated ideological purity above the concrete interests of their own people, willingly absorbing the costs of Washington's global strategy. They have devolved from the players moving the pieces on the global chessboard into a lifeless board itself. The decay of a continent that chooses to be a strategic resource for its allies stands as nature's fairest punishment.